Dr. Sarah Mitchell pressed her reading glasses against the bridge of her nose as she carefully lifted the fragile photograph from the archival box. The February morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Marshall University Special Collections Library in Huntington, West Virginia, casting long shadows across her workspace. Outside, the bare trees of the Appalachian foothills stood stark against a gray sky, threatening snow. Sarah had been the head of the university's Historical Preservation Department for 12 years, but she still felt a surge of excitement whenever she encountered a piece of the past that had been forgotten for decades. This particular photograph had arrived 3 weeks earlier, donated by the estate of Margaret Thornton, a 94-year-old woman who had recently passed away in a nursing home in Charleston. Her granddaughter, Emily, had contacted the university after discovering boxes of old documents and photographs in her grandmother's attic. Most were family pictures, but this one was different. It showed a group of children standing in front of a small wooden schoolhouse, their faces serious and formal as was typical of photographs from that era. The inscription on the back, written in faded pencil, read, "Spring Creek School, McDowell County, West Virginia. April 1888. Teacher, Miss Elizabeth Hartwell." Sarah carefully placed the photograph on the light table and switched on the LED panel beneath it. The image immediately came to life with startling detail. 15 children stood in 3 rows, the smallest in front sitting cross-legged on the ground, the middle row standing, and the tallest in back. They wore simple, homespun clothing, the boys in suspenders and knee-length trousers, the girls in long dresses with white aprons. To the left of the group stood a young woman, presumably Miss Hartwell, in a high-necked dark dress, her hair pulled back severely. The schoolhouse behind them was modest, built from rough-hewn logs with a single door and 2 small windows visible in the frame. What struck Sarah immediately was the condition of the photograph. Despite its age of over 130 years, the image was remarkably well preserved, the glass plate negative having been stored in a protective case that had kept it safe from humidity and light damage. However, there were signs of deterioration around the edges, and some areas showed the characteristic silvering that indicated the emulsion was beginning to separate from the glass substrate. Sarah reached for her phone and called her colleague, Marcus Webb, who specialized in photographic restoration. "Marcus, I need you to come down to Special Collections. I've got something you need to see." 20 minutes later, Marcus arrived, his winter coat still dusted with the snow that had just begun to fall outside. He was a tall man in his early 40s with salt and pepper hair and the methodical demeanor of someone who spent his days working with materials that could disintegrate if handled improperly. "What have you got for me, Sarah?" he asked, unwinding his scarf. Sarah gestured to the photograph on the light table. An 1888 glass plate negative from a one-room schoolhouse in McDowell County. It's in surprisingly good condition, but it needs stabilization and proper digitization. I want to create a high-resolution scan before any further deterioration occurs. Marcus leaned over the light table, his eyes scanning the image with professional interest. "McDowell County," he murmured. "Coal country." This was right before the big mining boom transformed the region. He pulled a magnifying loupe from his pocket and examined the photograph more closely. The detail is exceptional. You can see individual strands of hair, the texture of the fabric, even the wood grain on the schoolhouse logs. They spent the next hour discussing the technical aspects of the restoration. The glass plate would need to be carefully cleaned, then scanned using the department's state-of-the-art drum scanner, which could capture detail at a resolution of 4,000 dots per inch. After that, Marcus would use specialized software to remove dust, correct exposure inconsistencies, and repair any physical damage to the emulsion. "I'll start the process tomorrow," Marcus said. "This is going to take some time to do properly. I'd estimate 3 to 4 weeks for complete restoration and enhancement." Sarah nodded. "Take whatever time you need. I want this done right. In the meantime, I'm going to start researching the school and the teacher. Maybe we can identify some of these children and create a fuller historical context for the image." Over the following weeks, Sarah immersed herself in research. She spent long hours in the university archives and the West Virginia State Archives in Charleston, poring over old census records, school registers, and county histories. McDowell County in 1888 was a remote, sparsely populated region where most families lived by subsistence farming and hunting. The coal industry was just beginning to establish a foothold in the area, but it would be another decade before the massive industrial transformation that would define the region for the next century. Finding information about Spring Creek School proved challenging. Rural schools in Appalachia during this period were often informal affairs, operated by itinerant teachers and funded by whatever resources the local community could scrape together. Many kept no permanent records, or if they did, those records had been lost to time, fire, or simple neglect. However, Sarah eventually found a reference to Spring Creek School in the 1888 annual report of the West Virginia Superintendent of Free Schools. The school had operated for one term, from January through May, with 17 students enrolled and one teacher, Elizabeth Hartwell. The report noted that Miss Hartwell was 22 years old and had received her teaching certificate the previous year from the normal school in Fairmont. Sarah also discovered census records that helped her begin to piece together the identities of the children in the photograph. The 1880 census for the Spring Creek area listed several families with children of school age: the Morgans, the Campbells, the Prices, the Whitakers, and others. By cross-referencing ages and family structures, she began to tentatively identify some of the faces in the photograph. Meanwhile, Marcus had begun the painstaking process of restoration. The glass plate negative had been carefully cleaned using specialized solvents that removed accumulated dirt without damaging the delicate emulsion. The scanning process took several days, as Marcus made multiple passes at different exposure levels to capture the full range of tonal information in the image. It was during the digital restoration phase that Marcus noticed something unusual. He had been working on enhancing the faces of the children, carefully adjusting contrast and sharpness to bring out details that had been obscured by age and the limitations of 19th century photographic technology. Most of the children showed the solemn, almost stern expressions typical of photographs from this era. The long exposure times required by early cameras meant that subjects had to remain absolutely still for several seconds, making spontaneous expressions impossible. Children were often told to maintain serious faces because any movement could blur the image. But one child in the front row was different. A girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with light-colored hair pulled back from her face, appeared to be smiling. It was a wide, bright smile that seemed completely out of place among the serious faces surrounding her. Marcus zoomed in on the girl's face, examining it at maximum magnification. Something about the smile looked odd, though he couldn't immediately identify what was bothering him. The texture seemed different, the tonal quality not quite matching the rest of her face. He adjusted the image processing parameters, experimenting with different filters and enhancement techniques. Then he saw it. When he examined the image at extreme magnification and applied a special filter that highlighted areas of different reflectivity, it became clear. The smile on the girl's face had been painted onto the photograph after it was developed. The paint had been applied with incredible skill, matching the tones and textures of the original photograph so well that it would be invisible to casual inspection. But under digital analysis, the difference in the physical properties of the paint versus the photographic emulsion became apparent. Someone, at some point after this photograph was taken, had carefully painted a smile onto this child's face. Marcus immediately called Sarah. "You need to come to the lab right now. I found something extraordinary." When Sarah arrived 15 minutes later, slightly out of breath from hurrying across campus through the snow, Marcus showed her what he had discovered. He pulled up the image on his computer monitor, first showing her the restored photograph as it would appear to the naked eye, then switching to the enhanced view that revealed the painted alteration. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the screen. "The smile is fake. Someone added it after the photograph was developed. And they did an incredibly skillful job. Without digital analysis, it's almost impossible to detect." Sarah stared at the screen, her mind racing through possibilities. Why would someone do this? Why paint a smile onto a child's face in an old photograph? Marcus shook his head. That's the question, isn't it? And here's the thing that makes it even more interesting. Look at the type of paint that was used. He pulled up another view, this one showing a spectral analysis of the paint composition. Based on the chemical signature, this paint is consistent with materials that were available in the late 19th century. This wasn't done recently by some well-meaning but misguided conservator. This was done around the time the photograph was taken, possibly by someone who knew this child. Sarah leaned closer to the screen, studying the girl's face. Even knowing now that the smile was painted on, it was difficult to see the alteration with the naked eye. Whoever had done this had possessed both skill and access to the photograph. Can you create a version showing what she would have looked like without the painted smile? Already working on it, Marcus said. He opened another window on his computer, showing a digitally altered version of the photograph where he had carefully removed the painted smile using restoration software. Without the smile, the girl's expression matched those of the other children. Serious, perhaps slightly apprehensive, the way children in old photographs always looked. Sarah pulled out her notebook, where she had been recording her research findings. I've been trying to identify these children using census records and local histories. I haven't been able to definitively identify this girl yet, but I have it narrowed down to 3 possibilities based on age and location. Let me cross-reference this with what else I've found. She spent the rest of the afternoon in the archives, this time with a new urgency driving her research. She needed to know who this girl was and why someone had felt compelled to paint a smile onto her face more than a century ago. The answer, she sensed, would tell a story that had been waiting over 100 years to be heard. As the winter afternoon faded into evening and the lights of Huntington began to glow through the falling snow, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn into the mystery. She looked again at the photograph, at all the serious young faces staring out from the past, and at one girl whose smile hid a secret that was about to be revealed. The following morning, Sarah arrived at her office before sunrise, her mind still occupied by the mysterious painted smile. She had barely slept, spending most of the night thinking about possible explanations and planning her research strategy. The campus was quiet, the walkways covered with fresh snow that crunched under her boots as she made her way to the Special Collections building. She spread her research materials across her desk, photocopies of census records, transcriptions of old newspaper articles, maps of McDowell County from the 1880s, and several books on Appalachian history. She had also brought the photograph, now safely encased in an archival sleeve, and Marcus's digital analysis showing the painted smile. Sarah decided to focus first on identifying the girl with absolute certainty. She had narrowed the possibilities to 3 families who had daughters of the right age living in the Spring Creek area in 1888, the Price family, the Campbell family, and the Morgan family. The 1880 census showed that Samuel and Martha Price had 7 children, including a daughter named Lucy who would have been 9 years old in 1888. The Campbells, James and Rebecca, had 5 children, with a daughter named Emma who would have been 8. The Morgans, David and Sarah Morgan, had 3 children, including a daughter named Ruth who would have been 9. Sarah pulled up the digitized census records on her computer and began examining them more carefully. The census provided information beyond just names and ages, occupations, birthplaces, literacy rates, and property values. Samuel Price was listed as a farmer owning 40 acres of land valued at $300. James Campbell was also a farmer, with 60 acres valued at $400. David Morgan was listed as a carpenter and farmer, with 30 acres valued at $250. All 3 families appeared to have been established residents of the Spring Creek area, having been enumerated there in both the 1870 and 1880 censuses. Sarah made notes about each family, trying to build a picture of what their lives might have been like in the remote Appalachian community. She then turned to local church records, which she had requested from the historical societies in McDowell County. Many rural communities in 19th century Appalachia centered around small churches that served not only religious but also social and educational functions. Birth records, marriage records, and death records were often kept more carefully by churches than by county governments in this period. The records from the Spring Creek Baptist Church provided her first significant breakthrough. Among the handwritten entries in a leather-bound register, she found a record of baptism for Ruth Elizabeth Morgan, daughter of David and Sarah Morgan, performed in June of 1880. The record noted that Ruth was 18 months old at the time of her baptism, which would make her birth date approximately December 1878, confirming that she would have been 9 years old in April 1888. More importantly, there was an additional note written in the margin next to Ruth's name, added in a different hand and apparently at a later date. The note read, "Called home to glory, November 3, 1888. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. Ruth Morgan had died in November 1888, just 7 months after the photograph was taken. She immediately began searching for more information about Ruth's death. The county death records for 1888 were incomplete, many having been lost when the original courthouse burned in 1892, but she eventually found a brief notice in the Welch Register, a weekly newspaper that served McDowell County. The notice, dated November 8, 1888, read, "Died at the home of her parents near Spring Creek, Ruth Elizabeth Morgan, aged 9 years, 11 months. Ruth was a bright and cheerful child who will be sorely missed by her family and schoolmates." The funeral was conducted by Reverend John Blackwell at Spring Creek Baptist Church. She leaves to mourn her parents, David and Sarah Morgan, and 2 brothers, Samuel and James. Sarah sat back in her chair, staring at the brief newspaper notice. A bright and cheerful child. Was this Ruth, the girl with the painted smile? The timing was certainly suggestive. The photograph was taken in April 1888, Ruth died in November 1888, and the smile had been painted onto the photograph using materials consistent with that time period. But she needed more evidence to be certain. She returned to the census records and began tracing the Morgan family forward in time. The 1900 census showed David and Sarah Morgan still living in McDowell County, now with only one son living at home. Their older son, Samuel, had apparently moved away. The notation under "children born" and "children living" was telling. Sarah had given birth to 3 children, but only 2 were still living. Ruth was the child they had lost. Sarah then searched for obituaries and death notices for David and Sarah Morgan, hoping to find additional information that might mention Ruth. David Morgan had died in 1907, according to a brief notice in the Welch Daily News. The notice mentioned his wife, Sarah, his 2 sons, and preceded in death by his daughter, Ruth, who went to heaven in her childhood. Sarah Morgan had lived considerably longer, dying in 1923 at the age of 72. Her obituary was more detailed, providing information about her life and family. Near the end, it included a paragraph that made Sarah's breath catch. Mrs. Morgan was known throughout her life for her devotion to her family and her faith. She bore the loss of her only daughter, Ruth, with remarkable grace, though those who knew her said she never fully recovered from the sorrow. She kept a photograph of Ruth's school class in her home until her death, treasuring it as a reminder of happier times. This was it. This was the confirmation Sarah needed. The photograph had belonged to Sarah Morgan, Ruth's mother. And if Sarah had kept the photograph until her death in 1923, it seemed highly probable that she was the one who had painted the smile onto her daughter's face. But what would drive a grieving mother to alter a photograph of her deceased daughter? Sarah decided she needed to learn more about Ruth's death. The newspaper notice had been frustratingly brief, providing no cause of death. She turned to other sources, including the records of the local physician, if any could be found. In rural Appalachia in 1888, professional medical care was limited, and many families relied on folk remedies and traditional healing practices. However, births and deaths were sometimes recorded by traveling doctors who served these remote communities. After several hours of searching through fragmentary records at the West Virginia State Archives, Sarah found a medical ledger from Dr. William Harrison, who had practiced in McDowell County from 1885 to 1897. The ledger contained brief notations about his visits to families throughout the county, including fees charged and treatments provided. Under entries for November 1888, she found, November 1st Morgan, David, Spring Creek, daughter Ruth, fever, delirium, prescribed willow bark tea and cold compresses fee, $2, paid in chickens. Another entry 2 days later read, November 3rd Morgan, David, Spring Creek, daughter Ruth, passed this morning, nothing more to be done fee, waived. Ruth had died of fever, most likely typhoid or scarlet fever, both of which were common and often fatal in this period, especially for children. The illness had apparently been sudden and brief, just 2 days from Dr. Harrison's first visit to her death. Sarah imagined what those final days must have been like for the Morgan family. Their bright, cheerful daughter suddenly falling ill, burning with fever, perhaps not even conscious during her final hours. The helplessness of her parents, watching her slip away despite their prayers and the limited medical intervention available. The grief that must have engulfed the household after her death. And then, at some point after Ruth died, Sarah Morgan had taken out the school photograph, the last image of her daughter when she was healthy and alive, and had carefully painted a smile onto her face. Sarah shared her findings with Marcus that afternoon. They sat in his restoration lab, looking at the photograph displayed on his large monitor, now fully restored and showing Ruth's painted smile in heartbreaking detail. She died 7 months after this photograph was taken, Sarah explained. Of fever, probably typhoid or scarlet fever. Her mother kept this photograph for the rest of her life, another 35 years. Marcus studied the image thoughtfully. And she painted the smile because she wanted to remember her daughter as happy? Maybe, Sarah said. But look at the other children in the photograph. None of them are smiling. That was normal for photographs of that era. So if Ruth wasn't smiling in the original photograph, it wasn't because she was unhappy. It was just the convention of the time. Everyone looked serious. So why add the smile? Marcus asked. Sarah had been thinking about this question for hours. I think it was about memory versus reality. The photograph showed Ruth as she actually appeared that day in April 1888, serious and still like all the other children. But that wasn't how her mother wanted to remember her. The obituary said Ruth was a bright and cheerful child. That was how she had been in life, before illness took her. So her mother took the photograph and changed it to match her memory of who Ruth really was. She was editing reality to match her emotional truth, Marcus said softly. Exactly. And she did it with incredible skill. This wasn't a crude alteration. She took enormous care to make the smile look natural, to blend the paint so seamlessly that unless you knew what to look for, you would never detect it. It was an act of love, really. A mother refusing to let her daughter be remembered only through the formality and seriousness of an old photograph. Marcus leaned back in his chair. This changes everything about how we present this photograph. It's not just a historical artifact anymore. It's a memorial, a testament to a mother's grief and love. Sarah nodded. I want to find out more about Sarah Morgan, the mother. I want to know who she was, what her life was like. And I want to see if there are any living descendants who might want to know this story. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah pursued these questions with the same determination she had brought to identifying Ruth. She pieced together Sarah Morgan's life from fragments of historical records, census entries, tax records, church records, and the few newspaper mentions that survived. Sarah Morgan, née Porter, had been born in 1851 in Tazewell County, Virginia, just across the border from what would become West Virginia. She had married David Morgan in 1876, and they had settled in the Spring Creek area where David worked as a carpenter and farmer. The family had been modestly prosperous by the standards of the time and place, owning their land outright and being active members of their church community. After Ruth's death, Sarah had continued to live a quiet life, raising her 2 sons and supporting her husband's work. But the loss of Ruth had clearly marked her. Several church records from the 1890s mention Sarah Morgan organizing memorial services for deceased children in the community, suggesting that Ruth's death had given her a particular empathy for other mothers who had experienced similar losses. When David died in 1907, Sarah had continued to live on the family farm, cared for by her son James and his family. She had died there in 1923, and according to her obituary, she had been buried in the Spring Creek Baptist Church cemetery next to her husband and daughter. Sarah decided to visit the cemetery. On a cold Saturday in late March, she drove the 3 hours from Huntington to McDowell County, following winding mountain roads that cut through steep valleys and dense forests. The Spring Creek Baptist Church still stood, a small white clapboard building on a hillside overlooking the creek that gave the area its name. The cemetery was behind the church, enclosed by a low stone wall and shaded by ancient oak trees. She found the Morgan family plot near the back of the cemetery. David Morgan's headstone was a simple granite marker with his name and dates. Next to it was Sarah Morgan's headstone, equally plain. And next to Sarah's was a small white marble stone, weathered by more than a century of rain and snow, marking Ruth's grave. The inscription read, "Ruth Elizabeth Morgan, beloved daughter, December 12, 1878 to November 3, 1888. Too bright for earth, now shining in heaven." Sarah stood for a long moment in the quiet cemetery, thinking about the woman who had painted a smile onto her daughter's photograph, trying to preserve the memory of a child who had been too bright for earth. She took several photographs of the headstones, making notes about their condition and inscriptions for her research records. As she was leaving the cemetery, an elderly man approached her from the church. He was thin and stooped, with a weathered face and white hair beneath a worn baseball cap. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked. "Not often we get visitors up here this time of year." Sarah introduced herself and explained that she was researching the history of Spring Creek School and the Morgan family. The man's face lit up with interest. "Morgan family? Well, you've come to the right place. I'm John Campbell. My great-great-grandfather was James Campbell, lived up the creek from the Morgans back in those days. Some of the old stories got passed down through the family." Sarah could hardly believe her luck. "Did your family ever mention a girl named Ruth Morgan?" John Campbell's expression grew solemn. "Oh yes. Sad story that was. My grandmother used to tell about it. Ruth Morgan was one of the children at Spring Creek School, died real sudden of fever. Just a little girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old. My grandmother said Ruth's mother never got over it, kept that girl's memory alive for the rest of her life." "Do you know anything about a photograph?" Sarah asked. "A school photograph from 1888? John thought for a moment. "Can't say that I've heard about a photograph specifically. But I do remember my grandmother mentioning that Sarah Morgan, that was Ruth's mother, she was an artist of sorts. Painted pictures, did needlework, things like that. Had a real talent for it, according to my grandmother." This was a crucial piece of information. If Sarah Morgan had artistic skills, it would explain how she had been able to paint the smile with such technical proficiency. Sarah thanked John Campbell and spent another hour talking with him, learning what she could about the history of the Spring Creek community and the families who had lived there in the late 19th century. By the time she drove back to Huntington that evening, she had filled several pages of her notebook with new information. But she still needed to find living descendants of the Morgan family. She wanted them to know the story of Ruth and the photograph, to understand the love and grief that had prompted Sarah Morgan to alter the image of her daughter. It took another week of genealogical research, tracing the Morgan family line through marriage records, census data, and modern phone directories, but Sarah eventually found what she was looking for. Thomas Morgan lived in Bluefield, West Virginia, about 60 miles south of the Spring Creek area. He was 78 years old, retired from a career as a high school history teacher, and according to the family tree Sarah had constructed, he was the great-great-grandson of David and Sarah Morgan through their son James. Ruth Morgan had been his great-great-aunt. Sarah called him one evening, introducing herself and explaining her research. Thomas listened with growing interest, and when she told him about the photograph and the painted smile, he was silent for a long moment. "I never knew about that photograph," he said finally. "I knew about Ruth. My father told me the story when I was young. He said she was the lost daughter, the one the family never forgot. But I didn't know there was a photograph, or that my great-great-grandmother had painted a smile on it." Sarah arranged to meet with Thomas the following week, bringing high-resolution prints of both the original photograph and the restored version showing Ruth's painted smile. When Thomas saw the images, his eyes filled with tears. "That's her," he said softly. "That's Ruth. And that's my great-great-grandmother's handiwork on that smile. My father used to tell me she was an incredibly talented artist, that she could paint pictures and do needlework that looked like professional work. She used those skills to keep her daughter's memory alive." Thomas Morgan sat at Sarah's desk in the Special Collections Library, carefully studying the restored photograph through a magnifying glass. Outside, the late March afternoon was giving way to evening, and the shadows in the room had grown long. Sarah had printed several versions of the image at different sizes, along with Marcus's technical analysis showing the painted smile and the digitally reconstructed version showing how Ruth would have looked without the alteration. "My father never told me about a school photograph," Thomas said, setting down the magnifying glass. He mentioned Ruth many times over the years, always with a kind of sadness in his voice, like her death was something that had affected the whole family for generations. But I never understood why until now. Sarah had prepared carefully for this meeting, assembling all the historical records she had discovered about Ruth, Sarah Morgan, and the Spring Creek community. She wanted Thomas to understand not just the facts of what happened, but the emotional and cultural context that made Sarah Morgan's act of painting the smile both unusual and deeply meaningful. "Let me share with you what I've learned about your great-great-grandmother," Sarah said. She opened a folder containing photocopies of the church records, census documents, and newspaper clippings she had gathered. Sarah Morgan was born Sarah Porter in 1851 in Tazewell County, Virginia. Her family moved to what is now West Virginia when she was a teenager, settling in the coal mining region just as the industry was beginning to develop. Thomas leaned forward, eager to hear more about his ancestor. What was she like? I mean, beyond just the facts. Sarah pulled out her notes. From what I can piece together from various sources, she was an educated woman by the standards of her time and place. Church records show that she could read and write, which wasn't universal in rural Appalachia during this period. The obituary I found mentioned her involvement in various church activities, organizing memorial services for children who died in the community. And I found something else interesting. She retrieved another document from her folder. This is from the records of the Spring Creek Baptist Church Ladies' Aid Society. It mentions Sarah Morgan multiple times as someone who created quilts and needlework to be sold at church fundraisers. One entry from 1892 specifically notes, "A beautiful painted landscape on fabric created by Sister Sarah Morgan, which sold for the considerable sum of $3. She was clearly talented artistically. So painting a smile onto a photograph would have been within her capabilities, Thomas said. Absolutely. And there's something else I discovered that helps explain why she might have done this. Sarah retrieved another set of documents. I've been researching Victorian mourning customs and practices around death photography. In the late 19th century, there was a whole culture around preserving the memory of deceased loved ones, especially children. She showed Thomas examples she had found of post-mortem photography, a common practice in the Victorian era where families would have photographs taken of their deceased relatives, often posed to look as if they were sleeping or, in the case of children, as if they were playing with toys. The practice seemed macabre to modern sensibilities, but it had been a normal part of mourning rituals in that period. These post-mortem photographs served an important purpose, Sarah explained. In an era with high child mortality rates and limited photographic technology, many families had no images of their children while they were alive. A post-mortem photograph was often the only visual memory they would have. It was a way of saying goodbye and preserving the child's place in the family history. Thomas studied the examples with a mixture of fascination and sadness. But the photograph of Ruth was taken while she was alive, before she got sick. Exactly, Sarah said. And that makes what Sarah Morgan did even more interesting. She didn't need a post-mortem photograph because she already had this image of Ruth from the school. But the photograph showed Ruth with the serious, formal expression that was standard for the time. Sarah Morgan wanted something different. She wanted to remember her daughter the way she had been in life, bright and cheerful, as the obituary said. So she took her artistic skills and created the memory she wanted to preserve. Sarah then showed Thomas something else she had discovered, a medical history of disease in 19th century Appalachia. I've been researching what likely caused Ruth's death. The medical ledger I found mentioned fever and delirium. Based on the season, early November, and the symptoms, it was most likely typhoid fever or possibly scarlet fever. Both were common and often fatal, especially for children. The medical knowledge of the time was limited, she continued. Dr. Harrison prescribed willow bark tea, which contains a compound similar to aspirin and would have helped reduce fever, and cold compresses. But there was no effective treatment for bacterial infections before antibiotics were developed in the 20th century. Children like Ruth either survived or they didn't, and there wasn't much doctors could do to change the outcome. Thomas was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. It must have been terrifying for the family, watching their daughter get sick and knowing there was nothing they could do. It would have been, Sarah agreed. And it happened so quickly. Dr. Harrison's first visit was on November 1st, and Ruth died on November 3rd. Just 3 days from the onset of serious symptoms to death. The family probably didn't even have time to fully comprehend what was happening before she was gone. She pulled out the newspaper notice of Ruth's death again. Look at how the community responded. The obituary mentions that Reverend John Blackwell conducted the funeral and that Ruth would be missed by her schoolmates. I found records showing that the Spring Creek School was closed for a week after Ruth's death as a sign of mourning. The teacher, Elizabeth Hartwell, wrote a letter to the county superintendent explaining the closure. I found a copy of that letter in the state archives. Sarah retrieved the letter, carefully preserved in an archival sleeve. The handwriting was precise and measured, written in the formal style of the period. Dear Sir, I must report that Spring Creek School has been closed this week owing to the death of one of our pupils, Ruth Elizabeth Morgan, who succumbed to fever on November 3rd. The child was beloved by all her schoolmates and her loss has cast a shadow over our small community. I thought it proper to suspend lessons for 1 week to allow the family time to mourn and to permit the other children to attend the funeral services. I shall resume instruction on November 12th if weather permits. I remain yours respectfully, Elizabeth Hartwell, teacher. This letter tells us something important about Ruth's place in the community, Sarah said. The school closure, the teacher's evident sorrow, the fact that her death was noteworthy enough to be reported in the county newspaper even though she was just a child from a modest family, all of this suggests that Ruth was special in some way, that she had made an impression on the people around her. Thomas wiped his eyes, visibly moved by the letter. My father always said the family never forgot her. Now I understand why. She wasn't just a child who died. She was someone who mattered to her community. Sarah nodded. And that makes your great-great-grandmother's act even more poignant. She wasn't just preserving a personal memory. She was preserving the memory of a child who had touched many lives, even though those lives were lived in a small, remote community that most people today have never heard of. She then shared another discovery with Thomas. I've been trying to understand the technical aspects of how Sarah Morgan painted the smile. I consulted with Marcus, our photographic restoration expert, and with an art conservator who specializes in 19th century materials. Based on their analysis, we believe Sarah used a very fine brush and oil paints that she would have mixed herself from available pigments. The paint she used was matched perfectly to the tones of the photograph, which suggests she had considerable skill and experience with color mixing. The most remarkable thing, Sarah continued, is how she understood the anatomy of a smile. Look at the photograph closely. She didn't just paint a line for a mouth. She understood how the whole face changes when someone smiles. The way the cheeks lift, the tiny wrinkles that form around the eyes, the subtle changes in the shadows. She captured all of that with just paint and a brush, on a photograph that measured only about 4 inches by 5 inches. Thomas examined the photograph again, this time looking at it with new appreciation for the technical achievement it represented. She must have practiced, he said. Maybe painted other pictures to develop the skills she needed. I think you're right, Sarah said. And I think this photograph meant everything to her. She kept it for the rest of her life, 35 years after Ruth's death. When Sarah Morgan died in 1923, the photograph was mentioned in her obituary as one of her most treasured possessions. Eventually, it must have been passed down through the family until it ended up with Margaret Thornton, whose granddaughter donated it to our collection. Sarah pulled out a genealogical chart she had created. Margaret Thornton was related to the Morgan family through marriage. Her husband's mother was a granddaughter of Samuel Morgan, Ruth's older brother. So the photograph traveled through the family for over a century before finding its way to us. Thomas studied the chart, tracing the lines of descent. I never knew about this branch of the family. My line came down through James, Ruth's younger brother. I wonder if anyone in Margaret Thornton's family knew the story behind the photograph. Her granddaughter, Emily, who donated it to us, said she didn't know anything specific about the photograph. She just knew it was old and historical and thought we might be interested. She had no idea about Ruth or the painted smile. Sarah then brought out something else she wanted to share with Thomas: photographs of the Spring Creek area she had taken during her visit to the cemetery. She showed him images of the church, the cemetery, and the surrounding landscape. "This is where your ancestors lived," she said. "The area has changed dramatically since 1888. The coal industry transformed the region in the early 20th century, bringing railroads, towns, and industrial development. But you can still see elements of what it would have looked like when Ruth was alive. The mountains, the creek, the narrow valley where families like the Morgans carved out their lives from difficult terrain." Thomas studied the photographs with interest. "I've driven through McDowell County many times but never really thought about what it would have been like in my ancestors' time. It must have been incredibly isolated." "It was," Sarah confirmed. "The nearest town of any size was Welch, about 15 miles away, and in 1888 that would have been a day's journey by horse or on foot over rough mountain roads. Most families in the Spring Creek area would have been largely self-sufficient, growing their own food, making their own clothes, relying on their neighbors for help and community. The school was probably one of the few institutions that brought people together regularly." She showed Thomas a map of the area from the 1880s. "Spring Creek School was located here, about 2 miles from where your great-great-grandparents' farm would have been. Ruth would have walked to school, probably with her brothers and other children from nearby farms. The school term was short, just a few months, because children were needed to help with farm work during planting and harvest seasons." "Tell me more about the teacher, Elizabeth Hartwell," Thomas said. "Was she local?" Sarah consulted her notes. "No, she wasn't. Elizabeth Hartwell was from Fairmont, in the northern part of the state. She had received her teaching certificate from the normal school there in 1887, when she was 21 years old. Teaching in a rural one-room school was probably one of the few professional opportunities available to an educated young woman at that time. I found records showing that Elizabeth taught at Spring Creek School for only 1 year. The following year, 1889, she was teaching at a different school in another county. After that, the records become harder to trace. She may have married and changed her name, or she may have left teaching altogether. Many young women taught for only a few years before marriage." Thomas asked the question Sarah had been expecting. Did Elizabeth Hartwell know about Ruth's death? Did she know what Sarah Morgan did to the photograph? "I don't know for certain," Sarah admitted. "The letter I showed you makes it clear that she was affected by Ruth's death. But whether she ever saw the altered photograph, I have no way of knowing. The photograph belonged to Sarah Morgan, and she may have kept it private, showing it only to family members." Sarah then shared one more document she had found, a note written in the margin of the Spring Creek Baptist Church Register, dated April 1889, exactly 1 year after the school photograph was taken. The note, written in the same hand as the record of Ruth's death, read, "In loving memory of Ruth Elizabeth Morgan, 1 year with the angels. Her smile brightens heaven as it once brightened earth." "I believe Sarah Morgan wrote this," Sarah said. "And I think the reference to Ruth's smile is significant. By this time, she had probably already painted the smile onto the photograph, transforming Ruth's formal, serious expression into the bright, cheerful smile she wanted to remember." Thomas sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of history and emotion contained in the small photograph before him. "What happens now?" he asked. "What will you do with this information?" Sarah had been thinking about this question carefully. "I want to share this story with the public. The photograph and Ruth's story deserve to be known. They tell us something important about love, loss, and memory in 19th century America. But I want to do it in a way that honors Ruth and her family. I won't do anything without your permission as a descendant." Thomas thought for a long moment. "I think Ruth's story should be told. I think people should know that behind every old photograph, there are real people with real lives and real emotions. And I think they should know what lengths a mother went to preserve the memory of her child. Yes, you have my permission to share this story." 2 months later, on a warm evening in late May, The Marshall University Special Collections Library hosted a public presentation about the Spring Creek School photograph and the story of Ruth Morgan. Sarah had worked with the university's communications department to promote the event, and the response had exceeded all expectations. The library's presentation room, which could hold about 75 people, was filled to capacity, with additional attendees standing along the walls. Sarah stood at the front of the room, with a large screen behind her displaying the restored photograph. Thomas Morgan sat in the front row, along with several other descendants of the Spring Creek families who had been identified through Sarah's research. Marcus Webb was also present, ready to explain the technical aspects of the restoration and the discovery of the painted smile. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Sarah began. "We're here to share with you a remarkable story that has been hidden for more than 130 years. It's a story about a child, a mother, and a photograph. But it's also a story about love, loss, and the lengths we go to preserve the memories of those we've lost." She advanced to the next slide, showing the original photograph as it had been when first donated to the university. This photograph came to us as part of an estate donation. At first glance, it seemed like a typical example of 19th century school photography. A group of children and their teacher posed in front of a rural schoolhouse. Valuable as historical documentation, certainly, but not obviously unique. The next slide showed a close-up of Ruth's face with the painted smile. But when our photographic restoration specialist, Marcus Webb, began the process of digitally restoring this image, he discovered something extraordinary. One of the children in this photograph, this girl in the front row, appeared to be smiling. And under careful analysis, Marcus determined that the smile had been painted onto the photograph after it was developed. There was a murmur of interest from the audience. Sarah let them absorb this information before continuing. This discovery raised obvious questions. Who was this child? Why would someone paint a smile onto her face? And what did this alteration tell us about the people involved? Over the past 3 months, I've been conducting research to answer these questions, and tonight I'm going to share with you what I've learned. She advanced through a series of slides showing the historical documents she had uncovered: census records, church registers, newspaper clippings, and the medical ledger. She explained how she had identified Ruth Morgan, traced her family history, and discovered the circumstances of her death from fever in November 1888, just 7 months after the photograph was taken. Ruth Elizabeth Morgan was 9 years old when this photograph was taken, Sarah said, showing a slide with Ruth's basic biographical information. She was the only daughter of David and Sarah Morgan, farmers who lived near Spring Creek in McDowell County. By all accounts, she was a bright and cheerful child, beloved by her family and her community. The next slide showed the notice of Ruth's death from the Welch Register. Sarah read it aloud, then explained the likely medical cause of death and the limited treatment options available in 1888. Ruth's death would have been devastating for her family, Sarah continued. The loss of a child is always tragic, but in the 19th century, it was also heartbreakingly common. Diseases that we can now prevent or cure with modern medicine were often death sentences. Families in rural Appalachia lived with this reality constantly, knowing that any of their children could be taken without warning. She showed the photograph of Ruth's grave marker, with its inscription, "Too bright for earth, now shining in heaven." Several people in the audience wiped their eyes. But this story doesn't end with Ruth's death, Sarah said. It continues with her mother, Sarah Morgan. And this is where the painted smile becomes significant. She explained Sarah Morgan's background, her artistic skills, and her involvement in the church community. She showed examples of Victorian mourning practices and death photography, providing context for understanding how families in this period dealt with grief and preserved memories of their deceased loved ones. Sarah Morgan had artistic talent and skill, Sarah said. She used these skills to transform the photograph of her daughter. She took Ruth's formal, serious expression, which was standard for photographs of that era, and changed it to reflect the way she remembered Ruth in life, bright and cheerful, always smiling. Marcus then took over to explain the technical aspects of the discovery and restoration. He showed slides illustrating how the painted smile had been detected through digital analysis, explained the materials Sarah Morgan had likely used, and demonstrated the remarkable skill required to create such a seamless alteration. What makes this so extraordinary from a conservation standpoint, Marcus said, is the level of technical proficiency displayed. Sarah Morgan didn't just add a crude smile. She understood the anatomy of facial expressions, the way light and shadow work, the subtle changes that occur across the entire face when someone smiles. And she executed this on a photograph that measured only about 4 by 5 inches, using materials she probably made herself. It's an impressive achievement by any standard. He showed the digitally reconstructed version of the photograph with the smile removed, allowing the audience to see how Ruth would have actually appeared on the day the photograph was taken. The contrast was striking. Without the smile, Ruth looked like all the other children in the photograph, serious and slightly apprehensive. But with the smile, Marcus said, advancing to the restored version with the painted alteration, Ruth becomes unique. She stands out from all the other children. She becomes the bright and cheerful girl that her mother remembered. Sarah returned to the podium. "I want to be clear about what we're looking at here," she said. "This is not a case of historical fraud or deception." Sarah Morgan wasn't trying to fool anyone or to falsify history. She was engaging in a private act of memory-making. This photograph belonged to her, and she altered it to serve her own emotional needs. It was a way of keeping her daughter alive in the only way she could. She showed a slide with the quote from Sarah Morgan's obituary about keeping the photograph until her death. Sarah Morgan treasured this photograph for 35 years after Ruth died. It was mentioned specifically in her obituary as one of her most valued possessions. Think about what that means. For more than 3 decades, Sarah looked at this image of her daughter with the smile she had carefully painted and found comfort in it. The next slide showed the genealogical chart Sarah had created, tracing Ruth's family line to the present day. Thanks to genealogical research, we've been able to connect with living descendants of the Morgan family. Thomas Morgan, Ruth's great-great-nephew, is here with us tonight. Thomas stood up and turned to face the audience. There was warm applause. "Thomas has graciously given permission for this story to be shared publicly," Sarah continued. "He believes, as I do, that Ruth's story deserves to be known and that it can help us understand something important about human experience across time." She then opened the presentation to questions from the audience. The first came from a woman who identified herself as a genealogist. "Have you been able to identify any of the other children in the photograph?" the woman asked. Sarah nodded. "Yes, we've made tentative identifications of about half the children based on census records and local histories. We're in the process of trying to locate descendants of these other families as well. Each child in this photograph has their own story, and we're working to recover as many of those stories as possible." A man raised his hand. "What will happen to the photograph now? Will it be displayed publicly?" "The photograph is now part of the Marshall University Special Collections Permanent Archive," Sarah explained. "We're creating a digital exhibition that will be available online, so anyone can view the photograph and learn Ruth's story. We're also planning to create high-quality reproduction prints that can be displayed in the library and potentially in other locations." Thomas Morgan has indicated that he would like to see the photograph shared with the Spring Creek community, so we're working with local historical societies to make that happen. A woman in the back raised her hand. "You mentioned that painting photographs was related to Victorian mourning customs. How common was it for people to alter photographs of deceased loved ones?" Marcus fielded this question. Altering photographs of the deceased was actually fairly common in the Victorian era, though it took different forms. Sometimes photographs would be hand-colored to add lifelike tints to black and white images. Post-mortem photographs might be retouched to open closed eyes or to remove signs of illness. What makes Sarah Morgan's alteration unusual is the extent of the change and the technical skill involved. She didn't just tint the image or remove blemishes. She fundamentally changed her daughter's expression to reflect how she wanted to remember her. Several more questions followed, covering topics ranging from the technical details of the photographic restoration to the broader historical context of life in 19th century Appalachia. Finally, an elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. Her voice quavered slightly as she spoke. "I lost a daughter 30 years ago," she said. She was 14. I have photographs of her, but like Ruth, she looks serious in most of them. That's just how she was when she posed for pictures. But I remember her smile so clearly, the way her whole face would light up when she was happy. I've always wished I had a photograph that captured that. What Sarah Morgan did. I understand it completely. There was a long moment of silence in the room. Sarah felt her own eyes fill with tears. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah said softly. I think what you've said captures the heart of this story. Ruth's photograph speaks to a universal human experience, the gap between how we appear in formal photographs and how we actually are in life. Sarah Morgan tried to bridge that gap, to create a visual memory that matched her emotional memory. In doing so, she created something that still resonates with us more than a century later. After the presentation concluded, many attendees came forward to view the photograph more closely. Sarah had brought several high-resolution prints, including enlarged views of Ruth's face showing the painted smile in detail. People examined them quietly, many visibly moved by the story they had heard. Thomas Morgan spent a long time talking with other descendants who had been identified through the research. They shared family stories and memories, connecting across generations to a shared history that had been largely forgotten until the photograph was rediscovered. Emily Thornton, the woman who had originally donated the photograph, was also present. She approached Sarah during the reception after the presentation. I had no idea, she said, shaking her head in wonder. When I found that photograph in my grandmother's attic, I thought it was just an old picture. I never imagined there was such a story behind it. Your decision to donate it to the university made this discovery possible, Sarah told her. If the photograph had been sold at an estate sale or thrown away, this story would have remained hidden forever. Ruth would have been forgotten. Emily looked at the photograph on display. I'm glad I made the right choice. My grandmother would have been pleased to know that this story is being told. In the weeks following the presentation, the story of Ruth Morgan and the painted smile attracted significant media attention. Local newspapers and television stations covered it, and the story was picked up by several national news outlets. The Marshall University website featuring the digital exhibition received thousands of visitors from around the country and internationally. Sarah was contacted by other historians and archivists who had encountered similar cases of altered photographs in their collections. The discovery prompted a broader conversation about Victorian mourning practices, the role of photography in preserving memory, and the ways people across different eras have dealt with grief and loss. One unexpected development was the response from the town of Welch and McDowell County. The local historical society reached out to Sarah, expressing interest in creating a memorial to Ruth Morgan and the other children who had attended Spring Creek School. They wanted to place a historical marker at the site of the school, which no longer existed but whose location could be identified from old maps and property records. Thomas Morgan was enthusiastic about this proposal. It would mean so much to know that Ruth is being remembered in the place where she lived and went to school, he told Sarah. And not just Ruth, but all the other children in that photograph, all the families who lived in that remote mountain community. Their stories deserve to be preserved. Sarah worked with the Historical Society to develop the memorial project. They planned a marker that would include a reproduction of the photograph, information about the school and the community, and Ruth's story. The dedication ceremony was scheduled for October, near the anniversary of Ruth's death. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her research into the other children in the photograph. She had successfully identified 12 of the 15 students and was working on the remaining 3. Each identification led to more stories, more connections to living descendants, more threads of history that could be woven together to create a fuller picture of life in Spring Creek in 1888. She also worked with Marcus to create a detailed technical paper about the photographic restoration and analysis of the painted smile. The paper would be published in a professional journal for conservators and archivists, sharing the techniques they had developed and encouraging others to look more carefully at altered photographs in their collections. On a warm evening in early October, Sarah stood once again in the Spring Creek Baptist Church Cemetery, this time accompanied by a group of about 50 people who had gathered for the dedication of the historical marker. Thomas Morgan was there, along with several other descendants of the families from the photograph. Members of the local historical society, officials from Marshall University, and many residents of McDowell County had also come to witness the ceremony. The marker had been placed near the site where Spring Creek School had once stood, just a few hundred yards from the cemetery. It was a handsome bronze plaque mounted on a granite base, with the restored photograph reproduced in durable enamel. The text read, "Spring Creek School 1888. On this site stood Spring Creek School, a one-room schoolhouse that served the children of this community in the late 19th century. The photograph shows the students and teacher, Miss Elizabeth Hartwell, in April 1888. Among these children was Ruth Elizabeth Morgan, 1878 to 1888, whose bright spirit touched all who knew her. After Ruth's death from fever in November 1888, her mother, Sarah Morgan, painted a smile onto Ruth's face in this photograph, transforming her formal expression into the joyful countenance her family remembered. This remarkable act of love and memory-making reflects the universal human need to preserve the essence of those we have lost. The photograph, preserved through generations of the Morgan family, was restored in 2025, revealing both the skilled artistry of Sarah Morgan and the enduring power of a mother's love. May the memory of Ruth Morgan and all the children of Spring Creek School inspire us to cherish our own loved ones and to preserve their stories for future generations. As the covering was removed from the marker, there was a moment of profound silence. Then Thomas Morgan stepped forward and placed a bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the marker. Others followed, until the marker was surrounded by flowers, some from nearby gardens and some gathered from the mountain meadows, like those Ruth herself might have picked as a child. Sarah spoke briefly about the journey of discovery that had begun when the photograph first arrived at the university. She thanked everyone who had contributed to the research and preservation of Ruth's story. But mostly, she talked about the importance of remembering, of keeping the past alive so that future generations could understand where they came from. History isn't just about dates and facts, she said. It's about people. Real people who lived and loved and suffered and died, just as we do. Ruth Morgan was one of those people. She lived only 9 years, in a place that most people today have never heard of. But her life mattered. Her smile mattered. And her mother's love mattered. That's what this marker represents. The enduring importance of individual human lives, no matter how seemingly small or forgotten. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Sarah walked to Ruth's grave, just visible through the trees. The headstone was weathered but still legible. Someone had recently cleaned it, removing the accumulated moss and lichen. Fresh flowers lay at its base. Sarah thought about Sarah Morgan, standing in this same spot more than a century earlier, grieving her daughter and trying to find a way to keep her memory alive. She thought about the photograph, carefully altered to capture the smile that Sarah remembered so well. And she thought about how that act of love had transcended time, allowing Ruth's story to be told again to a new generation. The sun was setting over the Appalachian Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Sarah took a photograph of Ruth's grave marker in the evening light, knowing that she would include it in the final report on the project. But more than that, she wanted to preserve this moment, this connection across time between past and present. As she walked back down the hillside toward her car, Sarah reflected on what the discovery of Ruth's photograph had taught her. It had reinforced her belief in the importance of historical preservation, in the value of careful research and attention to detail. But it had also reminded her that behind every artifact, every document, every photograph in an archive, there were real people with real emotions and real stories. Ruth Morgan's smile, painted by a grieving mother more than a century ago, had survived to tell a story about love, loss, and memory that resonated across generations. It was a reminder that the past was not dead, that it lived on in the objects and images that survived, waiting to be discovered and understood by those with the patience and dedication to listen to its stories. The photograph now resided safely in the Marshall University archives, preserved digitally and physically for future generations. But its impact extended far beyond the walls of the library. It had reconnected families to their past, prompted conversations about memory and mourning, and reminded people that every life, no matter how humble or brief, has value and deserves to be remembered. Sarah drove back to Huntington as darkness fell over the mountains, carrying with her the memory of Ruth's painted smile and the knowledge that she had helped preserve a story that might otherwise have been lost forever. The photograph would continue to be studied, shared, and discussed, ensuring that Ruth Morgan and her mother's remarkable act of love would not be forgotten. In homes across West Virginia and beyond, descendants of the Spring Creek families shared the story with their own children and grandchildren, passing down the tale of a girl who died too young and a mother who refused to let her daughter's brightness be forgotten. New flowers appeared regularly on Ruth's grave, left by people who had been moved by her story. And in the university archives, researchers and students continued to examine the photograph, drawn by the technical achievement of Sarah Morgan's painted smile and by the universal human story it represented. They learned not just about 19th century photography or Victorian mourning customs, but about the enduring power of love to transcend time and about the ways we all try to preserve the memories of those who matter most to us. Ruth Morgan's smile, painted more than a century ago by her grieving mother, continued to shine brightly, just as the inscription on her gravestone had promised, "Too bright for earth," now preserved forever in the careful work of an artist mother and the dedicated research of those who refused to let her story die. The story of the painted smile became part of Marshall University's teaching curriculum, used in classes on history, archival science, art conservation, and photography. Students learned not just about the technical aspects of photographic restoration, but about the human stories that artifacts could tell. They learned to look beyond the surface of historical objects, to ask questions, to investigate carefully, and to recognize that every piece of the past had stories waiting to be discovered. And sometimes, on quiet evenings in the Special Collections Library, when Sarah Mitchell worked late on other research projects, she would pull up the digital file of Ruth Morgan's photograph on her computer screen. She would look at that carefully painted smile, thinking about the mother who had created it and the daughter she had loved so much. And Sarah would feel grateful that she had been able to help tell the story, to preserve this moment of love across time, ensuring that Ruth Morgan's bright smile would continue to touch hearts for generations to come.